Thank you.
Please, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, David. It's a pleasure to be with all of you and be part of the conversation today. We already had a few weeks ago a global business call dealing with the issues around COVID-19 and the responsibility of business, or the role of business in terms of recovery. And most recently, we are working on a paper for the WEA dealing with a just economy, because COVID-19 will, of course, cause a situation where the impoverished countries, especially countries of the Global South, will deal with the economic consequences, which is, let's say, hard to solve, and needs some kind of response also from the Christian point of view. And so that's overall the goal of the business coalition at the WEA, to combine and to connect global leaders dealing with business, finance, and economy. So we have representatives as national coordinators in more than 20 countries. Some of you are serving as national coordinators. That's great to have you at this call too. And then we have different working groups or councils dealing with different questions in terms of business or economy. So I like to introduce Ruben as a partner heading the Transformational Business Network. We were already working on some issues in terms of impact investments, which is for poverty elevation a really important tool. And so Ruben, please introduce yourself a bit. Yeah, and then we can follow up on that.
Great, thank you, Timo. Hi everyone, my name is Ruben Coulter. I'm originally from Ireland, living in the UK, but I've spent most of my career working in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. I'm a public health specialist by training, although it's been many years since I practiced. I began my career with Tear Fund, the UK Evangelical Relief Agency, and spent a number of years in Darfur and Liberia and Congo in the refugee camps there. I then moved across to the World Economic Forum, who many of you know from the Davos conferences that happen every year. So the gathering of the ultra rich and powerful in the world. And most recently I've been leading the Transformational Business Network, a group of passionate investors and entrepreneurs who are looking to use their capital and their skills to change the world. Transformational Business Network was founded by two Christian entrepreneurs about 17 years ago. They were based in the UK, but they were really looking to see how they could give back and make a difference using their business acumen and their investment skills. Since then, we've opened an office in Singapore, we have an office in East Africa, and we work in 8 countries around the world. And our role is really to help encourage and equip entrepreneurs on the ground and help them grow their businesses and increase the social and spiritual impact those businesses can have. And it's to connect the capital holders, the investors, to those businesses, and hopefully be able to channel capital into these much needed sectors. But I do think, going back to Timo's original comment, it's so important that we set this in a framework of the just economy. And it's been really interesting. I've been part of a number of discussions in both Christian forums and secular forums of what is the purpose of capital? What is money there to do? And it's not, the answer is not just to earn more money, but actually it's a tool to serve humanity and to address the fundamental issues in our world of poverty, of healthcare, of nutrition, of all of these issues. And I think as the church, often we've been quite left behind on these issues. Often we tend to kind of take existing models and paradigms and stick a Jesus label on it. And actually the scriptures are 2,000 years of church wisdom, has so much to offer on how do we create capital that serves mankind, and how do we develop leaders that serve mankind. And unfortunately, at the moment, those leaders seem to be in short supply, or the wrong leaders get elevated to the top. And I guess it's our job, our responsibility to change that. So just to very practically give you an idea of some of the things which are happening, which may be of relevance. So we're focused on the business sector. And of course, there are many businesses which are working in areas such as education and healthcare, so have a huge overlap with the social sector. So one of the things we've been able to do is work with the National Christian Foundation, which is a donor-advised fund in the US. And essentially that pools a lot of the philanthropic capital of wealthy Christians in the US and helps them give to good causes, to philanthropic projects worldwide. And so they've been working on an online platform which helps showcase various Christian organizations all around the world, and just gives the donors a view and a way to engage these and vet these and decide which ones they want to back and support. So that online platform should be going live this week. We're initially just testing it with a very small number of charities, which we know, but over time we'll be able to expand that to many more charities. And we're hoping that at a slightly later stage, we'll be able to open that up to other businesses which have a social purpose. So at the moment, it can only, for legal purposes, it can only showcase and support organizations which are registered as not-for-profit charities. So that's through the National Christian Foundation. The second activity we're doing is an East Africa relief fund. And that's led by a Christian investment fund in the US called Sovereign's Capital. And essentially, we've been coordinating a large pool of Christian businesses in East Africa and helping vet those and circulate those to investors for investment. And most of these investments will be low interest debt. So it's not a grant, it's not purely philanthropic, but it's not on commercial terms either. And we're helping get those businesses in front of investors, again, mainly US investors, and that particular fund is focused on East Africa. The third fund, which we have been leading as Transformational Business Network, is an Asia Relief and Resilience Fund. And at the moment, that's being led by my team in Singapore. And that's focused on Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines. And again, that's providing low interest debt primarily, although there is some grant capital to support these social impact businesses which have been affected by COVID-19. So in terms of funds, those are the three funds that we've been working on. I must stress at the moment that these three funds are all relatively small. So compared to the massive need, which is in the billions of US dollars, these funds are in the millions at the moment. So they're providing obviously vital for some businesses, but still at a very small level. But what we hope we're creating is a template and a pathway which we can then open up and get much wider investment from the Christian community. This is all set against the backdrop of a slightly larger and longer term project, which has really been able to connect and support Christian entrepreneurs and investors worldwide and build up hubs of excellence in key regions all around the world. So we've got partners in Egypt, in Tajikistan, in Romania and Moldova, and South Africa, And we're continuing to build these and support these because we really do believe that business provides some vital solutions to many of the world's challenges. And we think that particularly in sectors like healthcare and education, philanthropic capital is going to increasingly dry up and become very hard to come by. And so we do need sustainable and scalable business models to support all of the great work that we care about as a community. So we'd love to understand what's happening elsewhere in the world, and begin to think and consider how we might scale up the responses that we're doing, how we might replicate it in other geographies. I can say more, but perhaps I'll stop there for the moment.
Thanks, Ruben. Yeah, let me emphasize this approach of an impact investment. So that's on our heart, to build community development enterprises which provide products or services through for-profit revenue generating businesses. So it's not another donating model. It's through businesses and ventures that also seek a measurable positive social and spiritual impact. So that's our guideline and approach on that. And so building small and medium-sized businesses will lead people out of poverty and help to rebuild also economic systems in a certain country with justice and compassion. So however we can do that, that's our goal. And that way we connect business leaders, but also not just with investors, but also with church leaders, to have an integrated model that church leaders, business leaders, and financial leaders and investors work together and build God's kingdom that way in order to help people's life. So yeah, and there are a couple of funds and organizations and institutes around the globe also let's say running this approach, call it business as a mission, or a business for transformation, or different terminology. But all in all, it's this approach to make use of business for a better world, whatever better is in that term. So yeah, probably that's David, the introduction, which leads now in a further discussion with all of you.
Maybe just one thing to add before David, you come in. One of the things that we have been working and supporting is a number of the large traditional NGOs are increasingly becoming interested in this approach. And so many of the kind of the household Christian names, World Vision, Tear Fund, Oxfam, are increasingly trying to understand what the role of business is in development, and also trying to understand what's their role in supporting these type of enterprises. So we've been consulting with some of these organizations and really helping them think through this new approach to what they traditionally do. So I think it's an exciting space, but these are large organizations, and it'll take time for them to adapt and change to, I guess, some of the new realities.
Well, Timo and Ruben, thank you very much for that introduction. And perhaps to start off our discussion, I might ask you to expand a bit on something for me. You made an interesting statement, Ruben, when you said that too often we take traditional models and slap a Christian label on them. And I wanted to ask you to expand on this and maybe share with us how the approach that you're describing in terms of investing in different parts of the developing world makes use of a different model. You know, how is that different from what is traditionally done to advance business? Thank you.
Yeah, so I'll give maybe a relatively simple example. Most often in terms of investments, we use two tools. One is debt and the other is equity. So debt, most of you will be familiar with, it just has a fixed standard interest rate. And regardless of what happens to you or your business, I don't care. I want my money back plus an additional percentage. So you are bearing all of the risk, and the debt may get you in a trap and impoverish you further unless you have the ability to repay. And so often we see nations become indebted, we see people become indebted, because debt is a powerful but dangerous tool. And for many developing countries, the interest rates that banks in their countries are charging can be 20, 30%, sometimes even higher for microfinance. So while it has been helpful in certain cases, in other cases, we've had cases of farmers who've committed suicide because of an inability to repay their loans. On the other hand, there's equity, and equity typically says, I will give you money for an ownership stake in your business. So if you give me 20% or 30% of your business, I will give you X amount of money to invest in that business and help it grow. Now, again, that can be very helpful. And obviously, if I come as an owner to your business, David, I may want to champion it, I may want to help it grow, give my skills, open up my networks, etc. But often equity can be used to manipulate and distort businesses, and I use my control and power to dominate your business and actually extract value. So sometimes what we see is outside investors can use the power of their capital to buy up a healthcare business in East Africa, and then they will try and maximize profits and minimize costs. And so suddenly the poor are paying higher amounts for a service because the business has been forced by its equity shareholders to maximize profit. And the original purpose of that business may have been to serve the customer and to serve people. So if there isn't alignment between the equity investor and the business owner and the customer, again, it can lead to perverse outcomes. So there are ways to structure investment which gets around this. The first is to make sure that there's an alignment of values between the investor and the investee. And that's why we're really keen that Christian companies can find Christian investors, because hopefully that means there will be an alignment of values and they'll really get the other missional activities which are built into that business. But also in the way the capital is structured, there may be ways to maximize and grow the social impact, not at the expense of the profitability of the business. So one of those instruments is called revenue-related return. And so it allows you to only get your return not as a fixed interest rate, but as a fluctuating rate depending on the revenue and the profitability of that business. Other forms of capital allow you to link the return to the social impact of the business. So the more patients I serve, the higher the revenue generated is for that business, and that is linked to the return on investment. So what we're trying to do is really think through different ways that the power dynamics between those who have the capital and those who are serving can be changed and fundamentally made fairer. And so it's complicated. There are no simple answers or solutions in this. And it does require us to test out and pioneer new models. So just to give you kind of two examples, just to make this really practical for people of how this business might look like. In East Africa, we are supporting and helping a business grow which makes sanitary pads. So women and girls in East Africa, if they want to buy sanitary pads, they're usually imported from China and very cheap and very poor quality, and don't serve the women with dignity. There are other expensive brands from the US and Europe, but they're out of reach of affordability for most women. So one of our entrepreneurs has created a local alternative of sanitary pads, which are high quality and low cost, and come with a Christian health education message to help women and girls understand about women's health, about hygiene, about sex education, all of these things which are integrated in the product that they're doing. And we've been able to help get both grant capital into these businesses, but also investment capital. Another business we work with is in Singapore, and it's a call center which is inside one of the maximum security prisons in Singapore. And we found that the prisoners in that prison just had no hope, no future. When they came out of prison, no one would employ them, and they often went back into crime because they just had no other way of supporting themselves, and they lost their family, they lost their dignity. So we were able to work with the prison authorities to set up a call center, and that call center serves lots of large multinational IT businesses in the region. The prisoners get trained up in how to manage and run the call center. They earn an income, they're able to save while they're in prison. And when they come out, we have call centers outside of prison where they can get their first job post-release. And that just gives them an employment track record and helps just build up their confidence, their dignity, and gives them a new start in life. And both of these businesses are profitable, and they don't rely on charitable funding, and they've been able to grow and support thousands of people. And so we're passionate about finding businesses like that and helping them succeed.
Additionally to that, from the investor's perspective, normally investors are interested in the financial benefit, but increasingly we do have impact investors around the globe who have, let's say, a differentiated view on that. So that we have, of course, a financial benefit. As I said, it's not a donation, it's an investment for a profitable business. But beyond of that financial benefit, there are social benefits or environmental benefits or spiritual benefits. And there are, meanwhile, some measurements how to measure these other impacts, and impact investment is such a great vehicle in order to do a good, but through a profitable business. And beyond the investors and the need for them and the business owners, we of course also need entrepreneur and employment training facilities. We do need local enterprise business incubation and co-working facilities in order to train these mainly young entrepreneurs to set a good framework, to have some support programs in order to stimulate among young Christians this desire to go intentionally into business in order to help people that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very good, Timo and Ruben. Let me remind folks to raise your hand if you'd like to comment or ask a question, or if you don't see how to raise your hand, unmute, and we'll watch for that and take it as an indication that you want to say something. Let me take this one step further. So in the present context, we have a situation where wealth is radically skewed and quite a maldistribution between the West and the majority world. And then on top of that, now we have the impact of COVID-19, which is threatening to plunge a large portion of the majority world population back into poverty. And some people are saying, given the scale of that crisis, that something radical is needed to help to pull the majority world back out of that situation, such as the West forgiving the debt of the majority world. And so I appreciate the examples of specific investments. I wonder also more at the macro level if you have some thoughts about how those approaches then can also address those huge issues that we are facing in terms of wealth, development, and poverty.
I mean, this Jubilee approach is a great example for indebtedness. So as soon as we give just more millions, billions, trillions into that system as a loan, we increase the dependency. So that is not a sustainable model, but to give freedom to countries in order, let's say, to build their own economy independent from the Western money, and to set a proper framework to give them access to the world market. That could be a solution and should be our approach on that. Ruben, I don't know if you have further thoughts on that.
Yeah, this is outside of my area of expertise, so take my ideas with a pinch of salt. This is from various magazine articles and books that I've read over the years. I guess there needs to be, I think, a top-down and a bottom-up approach. And so top-down, I think, requires significant investment in key areas of human development. And so the Sustainable Development Goals have set out those areas of human development and set out targets for those which national governments and regional governments have committed to meet. Those won't be met unless investment flows into these areas, both government investment, but also private investment. And there are various initiatives looking at kind of essentially blending or incentivizing private investment to put money into this part of the economy. And I think you need a kind of a mixture of carrots and sticks. So carrots are the incentives to get people to invest in this area of the economy. And obviously there's a change in how people are thinking about how their money is used, and people want to move their money out of, let's say, fossil fuel investments and into other areas. But then I think you also need sticks. You need to tax certain areas of the economy which are destructive. We need to make sure we tie up loopholes which are allowing money to be offshored and extracted and avoid paying tax in the relevant jurisdictions. So those are all top-down approaches. And there's no point fixing tax law in the UK if the US changes their tax law to make it more favorable, because corporations will just move very quickly and easily to avoid paying the right levels of tax. But I also think we need bottom up, and this is where at a national level, at a city level, we need to come together and think, okay, how do we implement and stimulate our local economy? And so East Africa, which is the area that I'm most familiar about, has begun to realize that perhaps they don't need to do all of their trade with other regions in the world. They need to focus more on developing internal trade markets within Africa with their closest neighbor. And they need to make sure that there's value addition to the products and the goods that they create locally. And because again, if they're exporting raw materials, there's not much value addition being created. However, if coffee is being dried and processed within East Africa, you're now adding value to it, and the economy is capturing more. And I think Christians have a huge role to play in this, from bringing about these ideas. There's a theologian and friend of ours called Andy Crouch, and he terms this the redemptive economy. How, as Christian entrepreneurs, do we think redemptively about how the world can be transformed? And he's done some really good writing, and I'd be happy to share links. And then also, how do we make sure that we have an ethical discipleship, both within the church, but within our wider society? And so we look at the impact corruption has on many nations and how it destroys value. And the church should be at the forefront of actually transforming integrity and character through its discipleship. And I guess very briefly to close, we've been in this place before. So the UK at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution was a terrible place to live. The average life expectancy in the UK was about 42 years for men and about 44 years for women. Children as young as 5 and 6 worked in factories. People were maimed and essentially enslaved in factories and had terrible working and health conditions. And it took a group of Christians, William Wilberforce, Lord Shaftesbury, to actually begin to reform society and to say, actually, we won't tolerate these conditions. It's immoral and we need to legislate change. We need to ensure that the church is leading on this. And that led to the abolition of slavery. It led to the introduction of a 5-day working week. It led to the creation of Sunday school. It led to prison reform. And we're in a time such as that. We need leaders who are pioneering and championing these things, and both locally, nationally, and globally. So I think for all of us on the call, it's an incredibly exciting time.
Yeah, thank you. We have a question from Ben Victor. Ben, do you want to just quickly say where you're from and who you're with, and then ask your question? I'm having trouble unmuting you, Ben.
Yeah, he may need to unmute himself.
Oh, there you go. Yes, hi, Ben.
Hello. Yes, hi, David. Yeah, listening to him, I have a few concerns with regards to our context in Africa and Cameroon in particular. First of all, we have the challenge of harmonizing training and good practice on the field with regards to helping local Christians, entrepreneurs, be able to come together and work and be able to develop their own local businesses. Now, in terms of raw materials, we have them, and a lot sometimes has been said about businesses, and a lot of people get excited with the whole idea and they want to engage. But the challenge is having models of good practice that have worked somewhere that can easily be adapted and implemented as a way of bringing together the training and the good practice. Otherwise, some people call it bringing theology and good practice together. So my question is, how do we do this in our local context?
So I think we are working on it, and we recognize and we know that that is a real challenge. And we've begun to pull together resources which have been used in East Africa and Egypt. And we want to now begin to make those available for others. And we want to begin training up some key people in this methodology so they're able to take it back to their local context and apply it there. Unfortunately, this is going to take a bit of time. I'm in the process of doing some research and making some recommendations so that we can get some investments to help us do this and scale this elsewhere. So I hope that by the end of the year, this is something that we could have to share.
And not to forget, it's also a theological process. So it needs an encouragement also into the churches or from the churches. So to build God's kingdom also in the marketplace, to send out people, not just for a mission trip, but also into business and help them and equip them and support them, whatever we can do. And with this network of a business coalition or the transformational business network and many others, we try to bring people together in order to equip each other and provide resources, material, consultancy, capital, whatever is needed to help a single entrepreneur to run his business properly. So that's on our agenda, and whatever helps in each country, so we want to establish it.
Mm-hmm. Mike, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I have lots of questions, but the one I guess I would start with is, we've all heard the analogy of give a man a fish and you feed him for a day, teach him to fish and he'll, be able to feed his family. But the other extent of that is, if he's fishing in a contaminated pond, he's going to be catching fish that harm and kill his family. And that pond represents the culture within which you function, basically. So if we, and I laud all of these principles, it's almost like we are now developing an alternative banking system for the poor to bypass some of that corruption. But if we are serving those who are in most vulnerable communities, poorest communities. They live in a culture of distrust. And if it's a low trust culture, we can throw all the money in the world at a problem and it's not going to be solved. If we are developing and giving people with talent and with business acumen these great tools and potential loans, but they're still working in a corrupt system where you have to pay at every level a little bit of, under the table money to get done what you want done, I'm wondering how we're going to have any long-term impact. And I know this isn't, confronting culture isn't what you're espousing, but if that isn't something that's addressed wherever, East Africa, rural India, then I'm afraid that we're going to continue to have this white man's burden, as Bill Easterly would call it, and we're not going to get anywhere because there's still countries that, I mean, in my own country, the US is getting even more like that. There's no trust, there's a fatalistic worldview, and we can throw all the money in the world at a problem. And if that's the predominant culture, our impact is going to continue to be minimal. So I'm curious to hear what your thinking is on that. I know you're not experts in those fields, but that's the reality.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I guess for us, how we think about it is that an entrepreneur only flourishes in a healthy ecosystem. And if an ecosystem is unhealthy, it's very difficult to flourish. You can be super talented, super bright, lots of energy, and you'll fail because the support isn't there. And that's accepted in the secular world. But I think often what the secular world overlooks is this transforming of mindsets and of hearts. And so actually I'll send the slide around later, but we're developing a faith-driven entrepreneurial ecosystem. But at the center of it is renewed mind, Christian community, and discipleship. And so it's recognizing that actually we need to help change people's understanding through the gospel of who God is and what his desire is for mankind and the planet. And we need to create communities, because on our own we'll just fail. On my own, if I try and live with integrity, I just give up because it's too hard. But actually, if I'm journeying with 5, 10, 50, 100 other fellow believers, then suddenly we have voice, we have power. Suddenly government begins to notice. Corrupt authorities begin to be afraid of us because they can't put the same pressure on us because we're in community. And we need discipleship, which is that we're all going to mess up. We're not going to get it perfect. And this is a journey, and we need to actually train up character formation as part of this journey. So I think that's fundamentally what's different about our Christian entrepreneurial ecosystem, is that these three things, renewal, culture, and community, are at the center of it. And around that then are the other aspects like training and support and markets and investment. All of those things are secondary unless, as you said, we get the foundations right. But those foundations are long-term. So it's not that we do one and then wait for the other. And we need to work at both simultaneously, because transforming cultures takes decades, if not centuries.
Christine has a question.
You're on mute. Oh, there you go.
Thank you. This is Christine, and some of my influence that's rubbed off on me is from some of the UN discussions. You mentioned at the beginning of your opening remarks the suicides that were taking place because loans could not be repaid. And I remember the day that that word came through of farmers committing suicide in numbers far too many. The reason wasn't that their loans could not be repaid. The reason was they had become very profitable farmers in terms of their ability to raise a wonderful crop and a harvest. But their suicide was the result. There was no market for their goods. And I think when we look at the corporate sectors of our world, they have dominated the market areas where local communities could be enhancing their ability for profit. But it will take a shift in the global markets and the corporate sector to say, hands off, this belongs to somebody else.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think one of the things that we need to do, and again, it comes back to power, and that individual farmer on their own is, even if they're relatively speaking doing well, they're still pretty powerless. They're small compared to a large multinational corporation. And this is where the cooperative movement and other forms of organizing together actually enables farmers and smallholders to increase their power and to increase their ability to negotiate in the market. And the church is the world's largest social institution, and we should be able to actually harness our power for good much better than we currently do. And I think that's a real challenge to the church. How do we mobilize the power of our collective voice, and also the power of our investment? I just think of myself as a Christian, and I don't know how to invest as a Christian. There is no way for me to invest as a Christian aligned with my values. And I think that's something which would be fantastic. We're able to create Christian investment banks to mutually support our community all around the world.
Yeah, great. Yeah, myself, I've got a question just after following the topic and the talks of different people. Just I know that the church is the basic element that unites many people at once, and where people can be taught in common. But I've got a question regarding to the pandemic of COVID-19. With COVID-19, many people have lost their jobs. Many Christians don't work nowadays. They are home already more than 3, 4, 5 months being home without any job. And this has negatively impacted the economic of a country or a household economy. And then people are eating beyond what they should eat because they are not earning anything to enter in their accounts. Then they are home, and some of the people, especially I'm talking about the underdeveloping countries, most of the people, they go to work and then they get something. As here in my country, here in Goma, people are not working, they are confined home. They are in lockdown, no one going outside. They don't have any income, already 3 months. And then most of them are Christians. They should be going to church. After a church, they should go in their business and bring, for example, orphans to churches and supporting some activities at church. Then all these things are not being done at church. Pastors, church leaders don't earn anything from Christians, as it is here in our countries, because churches support themselves through their Christians. They give some contributions. They can get lack of getting any support, then they can go ahead with buildings of churches. And then my question is this: we have Christians already home; they don't work, and tomorrow, at the end of coronavirus, if God wills, this coronavirus will get ended. And then when Christians will get back to churches, they hope to get some assistance from churches, different churches. He said, no. As we are already in difficulties, we want to go back to our church leaders and expose them our difficulties. There are some Christians who will come like this. Even in America, even in Africa, they will do so, I think. And then this has impacted negatively their economy. Then I would like from the brother just to tell us how the church churches can help, or how this in this meeting, what are the strategies we can give to different churches so that they can be able to fight all these questions and get good solutions to the Christians who will come to ask for assistance and to improve their economy and recover their previous economy. Thank you.
Great question, because churches do have a special function, and first and foremost, it's to provide a framework for community building. So it's not substituting any kind of capital support or business support that way. But in bringing people together, in creating this kind of community, churches over all the times were, let's say, facilitators or also accelerators of business ideas, of bringing together the right people in order to launch some projects, in order to encourage people. And this message of fear not is, in my point of view, one of the most strongest messages for today, in order to give people hope. So that's the first and foremost the task of a church, to encourage people to come together to do something. So I doubt that the churches can be better provider of capital or others. So that's a wrong expectation to churches itself, but to set the right framework and to give hope, messages of hope and trust into God's provision. That could be a role of churches also in post-COVID-19 time.
But I think, yeah, maybe, yes, I've got to your point, and it is very good. Yes, sure. But I know that, you know, that it is different for developing countries and developed countries are two different, the manner of thinking. But if there are some Africans who are in this meeting, maybe after this COVID-19, because I was on the field and I've been seeing that people are trusting, some people trust to go to churches and ask for a help. Let me go, for example, for Catholic churches. Catholic Church, they have just implemented some development department, which is there to raise, for example, funds and implement some projects in order to assist some, for example, displaced people with hunger. Then I would like maybe, if there are some people who are from developing countries who are in this meeting, we should know that at the end of this COVID-19, we should start thinking that there is another event which can come. By any chance, we don't know what is the plan of God. Maybe there is another event which will be very dangerous than COVID-19 in the coming time. We should start teaching from churches, local leaders of churches. We should start teaching the believers how to manage with their own capitals, with their small money they have, how to manage with this in order to know that tomorrow there is a problem which can come and they can be able to fight it. Because there are so many people who are dying from hunger during this COVID-19 because they did not think, and some local church leaders did not think about teaching those people from their churches how to manage with their capital so that they can be able to be just keeping something. And you know, in developing countries, most of Christians are not intellectuals. They do not study. And then we should organize some workshops in churches. For example, after church service, we can organize some workshops training those, especially women, because most of the people who believe in, who are strongly Christians are women in developing countries. Men, yes, they believe, but most of Christians are women. We should empower those women. We should teach them about on women empowerment, so that they can be strong, they can be well built in developing activities, especially in capital, to do activities which can help to sustain to the needs of their families. Otherwise, they will be getting back to churches and ask to the church leaders, and the church leader is not able to answer to all needs of the Christians. And then sometimes there are some Christians who can believe, I did not get a help from a church, let me live, and I don't believe, then he becomes or she becomes a pagan. But the way we should teach them at the beginning, knowing that there is another event which can arrive, but they can be able to fight this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mpenze. Yeah, I think you're really challenging us to recognize that, especially with the impact of COVID-19, we really need to think differently about some of the things we're doing in terms of development and the role of the church. And Viv, you have your hand up. You want to go ahead?
Sure, Brother Mpenze and Ruben, I'd like to try and connect these two concepts. I've worked in the slums for 40 years. And so you've got a conversation in the upper circuit and the lower circuit going on. And really the immediate need is the connection between those two conversations. So at the impoverished community level, the pastor's role is teaching economic discipleship. So that's the first step. That's part of a capital formation process. That needs to be mobilized at this point in the lockdown and the starvation. Already we need to be mobilizing the pastors to teach on rebuilding capital through cooperative mechanisms. Now they can teach, they can't provide the capital, but they can teach the biblical principles. Second is then the creation of the self-help or cooperative groups, whatever process, ASCAs, ROSCAs, cooperatives. If they've been in existence, they're going to need to be recapitalized from outside. So that's a question from Africa or from the slums of wherever I'm working into your business's mission network that we've put year after year, but never really got responses. So the process of capitalizing the cooperatives so that ownership remains with the people know what businesses work at the informal level. The next step, shifting them across to the formal sector, is very complex without a foundation of education and land rights where people have the basis for forming capital. So that's not something we can deal with at this particular point in time, recovering from COVID. Simply, we have to capitalize what is within the informal economy to enable people to get back to what they were doing, which was enough to live on, but not enough to move very far forward. The longer term approach takes a few years. So I think over the years, we've kept experimenting with this in different countries. I use 10 principles of economics, and I really appreciate your presentation, which have covered most of those principles, but it's been at the upper circuit level as against the lower circuit. And so I think our African brothers are asking, how do we get the investment through the pastors? And then how do we create the cooperatives in a rapid mobilization process over these next months?
Yeah, Viv, those are all great questions, and I wish I had simple answers. The reality is it's very difficult to bridge these two worlds between the poor subsistence economy and the ultra wealthy developed economy. And we have struggled to succeed in bridging that gap. Often we've been able to get investment into kind of technology-related businesses in the capitals of Kenya or the capitals of Asia, but to get it out to the rural poor in the informal sector has proved very difficult for a whole host of different practical and I would say mindset reasons. But it's certainly something that we are working on, and we're continually trying to innovate and figure out ways to do that. And I do think that there's a real role for the large international NGOs to act as a bridge and to help coordinate and aggregate markets, and also help channel investments in a structured way into some of these difficult to reach communities and reduce transaction costs. And so we're trying to work with them to kind of see how that might work. And I think the church has a role to play. I think we just need to be careful not to overextend the church into areas where it doesn't have capabilities. I think that the danger is the church gets pulled in to try and do everything and then does things badly or ends up getting mired in corruption or mismanagement, etc. So I think it's making sure that each of the actors plays to their strength.
Let me just see if we have any other hands or comments at the moment. While we're waiting, one follow-up thought that I would like to offer. You talk about closing the gap and the mobilizing pastors in the majority world to teach economic principles, to teach development. What about a corresponding effort in the Western world, mobilizing pastors to teach the need to, as you put it, close that gap? The responsibility of the West in terms of recognizing this maldistribution and taking significant steps, perhaps radical steps compared to what's been done in the past, to begin to realign that distribution. You know, should there also be a corresponding effort here in the West in parallel to mobilizing pastors to teach in the majority world? I wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
Absolutely. One thing that Timo and I drafted a few years ago was for the World Evangelical Alliance, a set of principles to help churches think about their investments. And really it was to kind of challenge their thinking. Church pension funds hold hundreds of billions of dollars around the world. Most of that is just invested commercially with potentially a kind of light screening to make sure it's not being invested in pornography or alcohol, but most of it isn't being invested for intentional impact. And we need to channel that money in the right direction. So I think there's a huge need. We're really encouraged as Christian Super as a pension fund in Australia, which is really pioneering this and doing some incredible stuff. But there's a lot more to be done. I do know in the UK, Tier Fund has been great in working with church leaders to educate them. But often I think we stop at poverty alleviation and we forget to kind of move to the next level. Actually, God doesn't just want to alleviate something. He wants to create thriving and prosperity. He wants to renew all of creation. And so actually it's not just a kind of a negative message of let's stop the bad things, but actually let's contribute to creating something better, which we need to focus on.
And fortunately, it's increasingly also a matter of subject at theological education in the Western world. So I'm dealing with a couple of different colleges and universities. They are putting subjects of a just economy, of business development as a holistic approach, whole life discipleship, as part of their theological education, which is very much appreciated and reflects these kind of questions, which is needed for a next generation of pastors and church leaders.
Yeah, Grace raises a question in the text box, again, suggesting perhaps where something more radical is needed. And Grace, do you want to expand on what you wrote?
You want to put me on the spot? Is that it, David?
I am.
Thank you both very much for this very insightful presentation and discussion, actually. And I think, like Mike Soderlin or somebody said, we need to keep this going. My big concern, and I just got off a webinar this morning by, I don't know if you all are familiar with Jyoti Banerjee. He's based in the UK. He's really thinking global systems and integrative systems, rather than continuing to think of our silo way of acting. You know, some of us work on the environment, and some of us work on business, and some of us work, you know, on these things. He's thinking much more integrated. But very deep in my own experience from years of working in the informal settlements around the globe, is that the way we think about capitalism and the way capitalism started in the US, where I live now, gives this, it does not allow for a really Christian evaluation of where are we making our capital? Where are we? How are we making it? Off of whose back are we making it? So many of the investors, I would like to ask, you know, Ruben, and in terms of the investors here in the US, and I know some of them, but many of them don't even ask the question of the roots of the capitalism. And I think that's an area where, as Christians, we've got to dig deep and to make sure that our way of working is a just way and a righteous way that is not off the shoulders and the backs of a lot of people, which in the US has been the slaves, and continues. And that's why we're seeing the unrest today, because they have never seen the fruits of their labor, and they haven't been able to work in the field and use what they want. So it's related to land justice issues, you know, which is something very passionate to me. So I want to ask you, my question at the end was basically, is there a conversation going on in the business circles of the WEA about that the roots of our wealth creation and the inequities that have come up that we just take for granted and don't even think about? This is the way of doing business, we'll do it. So that's what I'm throwing out there for you.
So a short answer is yes, this conversation is going on, but we are very much in the beginning. So we had, for example, this issue of wealth creation, now titled for a Business as Mission Congress, dealing with that. There are first papers going on. We have dealt with the capitalism issues with, for example, Michael Schluter and this relational approach to discuss the foundation of capitalism. Is that, let's say, an acceptable system also for a Christian approach, or do we need a different system? So there are some discussions going on, but it has to go on, and of course has to get deeper.
Yeah, it's a really great question, Grace, and as you well know, many of these things are deep-rooted idols in our culture. Capitalism is often synonymous in many places with Christianity, and people can often confuse the fact that actually God doesn't necessarily endorse particular economic systems. God is for humanity, and I think there's a huge amount of unpacking to do to address some of these deep-rooted issues which go back for hundreds of years. I've just sent a link called Faith in Finance, and which is a really great collection of Christians who are beginning to tackle these questions in a deep way. And I'm just really encouraged. I think there's some great people coming together, but it's going to be a slow, hard journey, and none of us like to be challenged when we have our set way of doing things and we've earned our money in a particular way. It's very challenging to have that being addressed head on. So it's going to be a tough but really valuable conversation.
Yeah, thank you for those comments. We have just a few moments, so let me put out a last call for any questions or comments you've been waiting to make. And while we're waiting to see if there are some, I would comment that I think part of what we're saying is that COVID-19 has impacted the current situation in a number of ways. It has, using Grace's term, pulled back the veil. It's exposed some of the inadequacies of our current market-based system. On top of that, it has exacerbated those injustices. And so we're seeing that in a variety of ways. Even, for example, currently with the breakdown of systems in the US, in part related to the greater impact of the COVID-19 on minority populations, which is tied to their economic and health vulnerabilities. And then on top of that, it creates an urgency. I mean, it's really saying to us, you know, we need to address these things, and we really can't wait 10 years to do it. So I think with that in mind, part of the focus of this group is to continue to address some of these issues with attention to the role of the church. And so in practical terms, how do we go about mobilizing pastors in the majority world, empowering their role to teach and to engage people in alternative development economic models? How do we mobilize people in the West to recognize this crisis and the responsibility of the church to begin to speak to some of these injustices? So I'm not suggesting we answer that right now, but I would hope and invite you all to continue to participate in a conversation about those issues and how we as a group might contribute by identifying mechanisms and tools that would help to do both of those things for the majority world and the Western world. So that's my summary comment. Anyone else comments or questions before we wrap up? And if not, I'll invite Timo and Ruben if you have any closing comments that you would like to share.
Ruben, do you have something?
Yeah, no, look, I think there's a lot to be done, and it can feel slightly overwhelming when we look at it and we kind of go, wow, I've got 5 loaves and 2 fish. What on earth can that do to feed the thousands? And I think we really just need prayer and wisdom of how to go forward, because certainly with the resources that we have to hand, we cannot serve the world, and we need God to help us grow and multiply those and figure out new ways of doing things. So yeah, we need just prayer and wisdom at this moment in time.
Yeah.
And additionally, I would like to invite you to follow up that conversation, and I will type our email in the chat, business@worldea.org. So please, yeah, send us your comments, ideas, thoughts, articles, questions. As I said, we are working on a common paper on just economy, but there are always some kind of discussions and debates and papers, white papers we're working on. So yeah, please be part of that and contribute whatever you have or you want to contribute.
Yeah. And so just as some ideas in terms of next steps, this group does have a voice into the WEA leadership team. We share these conversations with that team and use it as part of driving the conversation around policies and strategies at a senior level in WEA. So we do have a voice into shaping the next steps and future direction in WEA. And Timo and Ruben, I appreciate your support with that as well. Secondly, just another thought, yesterday World Vision announced a major fundraising campaign to address the great risk of a large number of people in the majority world going back into poverty and looking for ways in which they can help to prevent that. I think it'd be interesting to invite the people who are leading that fundraising campaign to speak with us about how they intend to use that large amount of money they hope to raise, and what are their strategies for actually being able to prevent people from falling back into poverty. So that's just an initial thought in terms of continuing the conversation. If anyone else has suggestions in terms of participants, speakers, and topics to help us to continue to address this very critical issue, please bring them to my attention. And in the meantime, as you've seen, we did record this conversation, and we'll make that publicly available to people to follow up. And we can also make the chat box available. So Ruben and Timo, I just again want to thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for your good work, and thank you for taking the time to talk with us. I think this was a very fruitful conversation, and hopefully one that we'll continue to build upon. So in closing, let me just offer up a word of prayer. Lord, we thank you for our brothers Timo and Ruben, and for the work that they do, and thank you that you have given them the heart of service, that you have given them the wisdom to address some of these basic issues, and a spirit of cooperation in terms of being able to work together with us. And Lord, we just pray that you'll continue to guide our actions as we grapple with these issues, and help us to know, not only for us personally, but also for the church as a whole, and the role that it can play to address these very important issues. Thank you for this day, and blessing on everyone here as we go forward in his name. Amen. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.